Funding for this program is brought to you by Bismarck Big Boy. From pizza burgers flying style to fast and delicious fried chicken, Bismarck Big Boy has been a local legend since 1954.
My mother's family were in shock. I mean, here's their little girl going off to the hinterlands, Bismarck, North Dakota, where, and are there any Jewish people there? Which there were, of course, as it turned out.
In 1930, Temple B'nai Ephraim was established, creating a home for the Jewish community in the region. Years later, the Wezelman family arrived in 1947, enriching this legacy and leaving a lasting impact on Bismarck.
Some of the first Jewish communities in North Dakota were homesteaders. There was believe that probably one of the first colonies was near Painted Woods by Washburn, North Dakota. These were mostly Russian Jews who were escaping the pogroms in Russia, and it was about probably the late 1800s. It was a difficult life for them. How they actually ended up in North Dakota, I'm not 100% certain, but there were maybe 50, 40 homesteaders there, and most of them were not farmers. So, and as most of us know, that land is not the most fertile or easiest to farm, and it was very difficult. So as soon as they had managed to prove up their homesteads and were able to sell them, many of them moved to the Twin Cities areas. Some came to Bismarck, and from there they kind of scattered, but each little town in North Dakota for many, many years had one or two families that had used the money from their homestead experience and what they got from selling it. And some of them became peddlers, again, to build themselves up and get a little money and income and be able to establish a business later. So in many of the little towns, there was either a store, grocery store. Later on, it was professional business. Many of them had, there were some trays, dentists, clothing stores, and almost every small town had a Jewish family in it. And then they would all come to the larger communities for the Jewish high holidays and other religious celebrations and observations. Our Jewish Temple B'nai Ephraim in Bismarck, got started way back in 1930 when all the small towns had Jewish families and they would come to Bismarck for the holidays. And it got to the point where finally the Jewish community here, which was not insignificant, decided they needed to have a building that would facilitate and be able to accommodate people coming. And at that point in time, they just didn't imagine that Bismarck would not have a Jewish population. My father came here in 1947 after the war, and he likes to think of himself as the longest one-year resident of Bismarck. His home was in Nebraska, in Omaha, and he then went to study statistics and mathematics at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Was from an observant Jewish family in Omaha, and kept kosher, and so he roomed in a single room in Ann Arbor and had a boarding contract for kosher boarding at a lady's house not too far from his room. He went off in the war and was in the Pacific. He was lieutenant colonel, and back then what they did was they put the Jewish most of the Jewish people were non-combatant, like the ROTC. They were they were officers. They put them in charge of the black units, as they referred to them in those days. So he was kind of in charge of, he was in the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal. But the service was a great leveler. However, in the service, of course, here's this Jewish boy, grew up and, of course, served the dietary laws. Back in those days, though, when you had pork, you ate because you had to eat to stay healthy, and that was allowed then. But I think that was not the most comfortable of times for him. And he did not talk much about his years in the service. He was proud of them, but he did not speak much about them. In the meantime, my mother, who was from Cleveland, Ohio, and was the youngest in her family, she was very ill a lot of the time, and her family thought she would do better if she were in Michigan, in Ann Arbor. She had a sister in Detroit, and that she was a medical secretary then at the university hospitals there, and she both boarded and stayed in a room at the landlady's house there, and the landlady played matchmaker. She thought my parents would make a good match, so they corresponded during the war, and when Dad got out of the service, they met in person and were married shortly after that, spent a year in Ann Arbor, and while Dad finished up. And when he finished, he was needed to find a job, of course, and back then actuaries, he had a degree in actuarial science, they were not the profession that they are now with many people, and his opportunities were to possibly go with the Social Security Administration, was just getting set up in Baltimore, with a reinsurance company, General Re in Dallas, Texas. And the other option, which ended up bringing him to Bismarck, was the state was establishing a hail insurance department at that time. He got contacted because one of his professors said, "Oh, you might be interested in this." Well, my mother's family were in shock. I mean, here's their little girl going off to the hinterlands, Bismarck, North Dakota, where, are there any Jewish people there? Which there were, of course, as it turned out. And so they decided to come here, and he said it would only be for a year. If she didn't like it after that, they would go somewhere else. She ended up really liking it and stayed. And so they stayed, but he still refers to himself, well, not now. He passed away in 2020. But he was, he's up until the very end, he referred to himself as the longest temporary resident in Bismarck. I myself grew up in Bismarck. My family's home at the edge of the Capitol grounds, and it was truly the edge of town back then. My cousins, we used to jokingly refer to our little corner up by the Capitol, and Norman and Charlotte Cammons. Charlotte was Sybil's sister, lived up the street, built a house up the street right before Northridge School. My family was at the corner of 3rd and Teton. My mother and father, Sid and Sarah Lee Slovan, and their 5 children were at the corner of Mohawk and 2nd. We would refer to that as the Jewish ghetto. And even though I wasn't related by blood at that time at all to this, they felt like family. Sam Slovan, my stepmother Sybil's father, education was very, very important to him, as was the library. When we built the newest library, the one that exists now, my parents, Dad and Sybil, decided that an appropriate way to honor Sam Slovan's and his wife Esther's memory would be to help sponsor one of the little study rooms. After he retired, he would spend much of the day in the library reading newspapers, dozing off. The staff they just loved him, and he would bring them cookies or apples on Wednesdays and Fridays, and they all looked after him very carefully. And so our family the Wezelman family was rewarded with the Pierce Award from the Library Foundation for being supporters of the library throughout the years, and I'm sure that will continue, but very important to education.
Help tell the stories of Bismarck's past and become a financial sponsor of this program. contact info@bismarckhistory.org to learn more.
My mother had passed away when I was 16, and she was only 42 years old. And my father remarried Sybil Slovan, who was the youngest of 4 Slovan siblings. And I think at that time, my father thought that it would be easiest, because he did want me to go away to college, hopefully to meet a nice Jewish boy. Of course, as almost everybody's dream for their kids was then, you met and married a nice Jewish boy or a nice Jewish girl. So he had gone to the University of Michigan, Creighton University, and the University of Michigan, and interrupted by service in the war. And so I decided on Ann Arbor because it was a larger school in a smaller town. In the 50s and 60s, my father, he was supposed to be the family rabbi way back when. He did not particularly want to go into the rabbinical path, but he was trained. Jewish boys went to, called Hader then, and learned his Jewish school after regular school. And so, of course, he was very well versed in all of the rituals and everything else, and the language and the Torah and the teachings. And so were some of the other people here, the other families. My father was with Provident Life Insurance Company. After the state insurance company, state hail insurance department kind of faded, Provident Life had opened. They were just built their new building in 1954 and were looking to expand. And some of them said, well, you have one of the best actuaries around. And so Dad went with them. And I think his first day there was the day that the new building opened, and I was 5 years old at that time. He also did part-time work for the state highway department, state highway patrol, doing some of their plans and things. So when we grew up, we lived at the Capitol grounds. I think we probably ended up driving some of that, but when he would work often on the weekend and Saturdays, and I would go with him and walk to the library from there, and then go over to his office afterwards, and then we'd go home. And the same with when he was at the Capitol, the state Capitol. Back in those days when he first came here, there was a 6-day work week, well, 5.5. And although the Jewish Sabbath is Friday night and Saturday, when your job demanded that you be there Saturdays, he would work on a Saturday in the morning. And again, I would go with him, and I would spend many hours in the museum as well there, the old museum. He ended up being president of the congregation for a while and the lay leader for many, many, many years. He did all kinds of things. He did bar mitzvahs. He would do weddings. A judge would have to sign it because he did not want to officiate. He never did want to be legally able to do ceremonies. So it would usually be a judge as well who would sign officially, but he would do the religious part. Bar mitzvahs, funerals, bat mitzvahs, which is, of course, when a Jewish girl or boy becomes 13. He would show groups through the synagogue when it was ours, and he would explain to them what the various things were. And I still have people who will come up to me and remember when he took them through. One time, this is kind of an interesting story, but a group of students from Cathedral came over, and he had shown them through and was explaining things to them. And I guess apparently Bishop Kenny had talked to them too at some point. That was when John Kenny was the bishop of the Bismarck Diocese. And the thank you notes got mixed up. Dads were sent to Bishop Kenny, and Bishop Kenny's were sent to Dad. And so he called the diocese and the secretary there. He said, well, I think we need to exchange these. And they set up an appointment for him. And the secretary, actually, at that time, who was Bishop Kenny's secretary or receptionist, turned out to be a woman who'd grown up across the street from us on 3rd and Teton. And she said, well, he's only got about a half an hour or so. They got along so well, though. They were in there for an hour and a half, and they really enjoyed visiting with each other. And Dad also had a good relationship with Father Kramer. And one time when my parents were away, I was at camp, and my parents took that opportunity to drive down to Nebraska to see Dad's family there. And I got a phone call from one of the physicians here, and this woman's husband had passed away unexpectedly of a massive heart attack. And would my father be able to, they hadn't been really active in our congregation, but they wanted to have a Jewish funeral in observance. And unfortunately, I had no way to reach Dad, and he wouldn't have been able to get back in time. She got Father Kramer to do it, and Father Kramer was, and I said, at that time we were renting our facility out and sharing it with another an evangelical group, but they were very respectful, and I said, I'm sure you can use it, but contact him. And I was leaving on a plane the next morning, so I wasn't even going to be around to follow through on that. Got back, it all worked out. Father Kramer did the ceremony, and when my dad got back, he always would tease him. He'd say, well, so I'm taking over your job now. But we always had I think for the most part, a very congenial relationship and an easy understanding with many of the other faiths around here. And it felt like almost like one big family. When my father got to the point where he was no longer able physically just to do some of the things he did, I started taking on some of those roles, and nobody could fill his shoes. I kind of succeeded him as president when we had fewer and fewer families, and the few of us who were here tried to keep it going. The people that were active in the 50s and 60s as the children of the children were going away to college, and their parents, and many of them moved to the Twin Cities or Denver, Philadelphia, Los Angeles. As their children started having children of their own, wanted to be closer to their grandchildren, of course, and so we just continued to shrink. It's not limited to Bismarck. This has happened to many Jewish communities in the smaller towns in the Midwest and the South. Max Blucher, who, with his wife Ruth, they ran a little store called the Corner Grocery. Max always had on, he was a little tiny man, always had long sleeve shirt, a white shirt usually, and a tie. He was a cantor. He had been a cantor in Europe. He came down with cancer, and he was in the hospital when I was about 12, and I didn't remember this before, but I went up to see him and say goodbye to him. And in the hospital, of course, got the hospital gowns and I noticed there were numbers on his arm. Well, apparently he had been, of course, a Holocaust survivor. But I didn't know that, and I didn't know anything about it until then, and I saw those numbers. I was not aware of the Holocaust. I did not know what had happened, because when I was growing up, that was so raw and near the surface that people didn't talk about it. And the Diary of Anne Frank, too, until that came out, and I was about 12 years old, and I remember my mother giving me a copy and making sure that I read that, and then we talked about it a little. Our congregation is pretty much non-existent now. We exist pretty much on paper. When you grow up with something, you take it for granted. And it started to mean more and more to me as I thought, well, how do I explain this to somebody else? I'm not quite sure why, because I just grew up taking things for granted. People just accepted us, and they were curious kind of too about, and I think the problems came maybe when some of them would say, well, can you take part in our youth group? There were only 5 of us about the same age when I was growing up. And, when they would have church nights on Wednesdays then and youth activities, and sometimes we'd be invited to participate. And I'm sure that was kind of difficult for our parents too at that time. I think most of us were brought up knowing what we were and what our faith was and what our religion was. And we pretty much ended up, I'm sure we were sheltered a lot by our parents, but we ended up growing up feeling very much a part of the community. And I never felt discriminated against in any way. The main thing that I would hope for now is to keep our little flame of whatever small community we have left here, keep it going as long as we can, and continue to help educate I still always appreciate a chance when I have to just visit with people about both Judaism and the differences all across the country even, and where difference, because I know for my own purposes, I learned so much about other faiths when I was trying to tell them, explain about mine, that I realized I don't know much about somebody else's. Well, it helps to know. And it gave me a great appreciation for my own too. And I do hope that we have not lost that permanently. I hope that we can continue to learn and grow from one another. So even out here in our somewhat sheltered, still protected corner of flyover land, there are lots of stories if we only discover them.
Help tell the stories of Bismarck's past and become a financial sponsor of this program. Contact info@bismarckhistory.org to learn more.